name is Ed Peck. I was born in Victoria in 1924. Lived most of my young life in Sydney, adjacent to the Gulf Islands. I enlisted in July of 1943. Prior to that, I had belonged to the Canadian Scottish Militia, the 3rd Battalion. But in July, after I had graduated from college, I joined the Canadian Scottish and was sent almost immediately to Camrose, Alberta, where I engaged in basic training. And while there, I was invited to stay on as an instructor. At the time, I wondered as to the desirability of this. However, because I was not yet 19 years of age, I knew I couldn't go overseas. In the result, I stayed for some time. My 19th birthday came and went, and no one announced that I was going to depart. So I was paraded to the major, who said, "Well, you're much too valuable to leave us." And that was nonsense, as far as I was concerned. So for the only time in my life, I wrote to my father, who was a famous soldier from the First World War, Colonel Ed Peck, VC, and said, "For God's sake, can you get me out of here?" Within a very short time, an order came through from Ottawa. And I was paraded before the colonel, who said, "We have an extraordinary order here. You're to proceed immediately to Curry Barracks in Calgary and thence overseas. I hope you didn't use any influence to this effect." I said, "Certainly not, sir." And then I left almost immediately for Curry Barracks in Calgary, where I completed my advanced training. And the following summer, after D-Day, I was dispatched to Great Britain. I arrived, and the first place I stayed was Sherwood Forest, as a matter of fact, which was rather interesting, and thence on to Aldershot, where everybody went. And later that summer, after D-Day, it was in August, early August, I was sent to France, where I landed on Juno Beach, or at least where the Mulberry Harbor was, and proceeded from that point on to join the Canadian Scottish in action. They had just completed the attack in the Calais Gap, and were moving northwest toward Calais, staying briefly at a place called El Bouf. Once at Calais, I was assigned to A Company, and I remember we were perched on the top of a hill overlooking the city, maybe 400 or 500 feet above. And while there, one evening, before we were to attack, Allied bombers came in, British and Canadian, in a low overcast. I'll never forget it, because you could see the tracer from the German air guns going out, and actually I saw 7 planes come down in flames, which was a very sobering experience. At that point, I decided I was lucky to be in the Army and not in the Air Force. Well, the first time somebody shot at me, they missed, needless to say, and it certainly got my attention. I couldn't see where the bullet came from, so I simply fired a couple of shots in the direction, and that was the end of it, because there was no subsequent fire. I remember meeting the guy that was the Captain Doug Gillen, his name was, who was actually in command when I got wounded. And he was quite an interesting story, which is told in the history of the Canadian Scottish. He was in the same building I was in, only he was in the kitchen with a couple of other guys. And what they didn't know or realize was there were Germans in the basement. And the story goes, and it's a true story, a German soldier came up with a potato masher grenade. You remember what those things were like? Opened the door, which was right behind Gillen, sitting there. He thought he was against a wall, and brought it down on his steel helmet and rendered him both unconscious and deaf for about 3 days. But he survived. And in the meantime, another fellow who was in the room, a guy called Chambers, in the confusion, took his revolver out and fired 3 shots into a sack of potatoes, which was in the corner. That was a war, you know. I mean, these things happen. As soon as I remember, somehow I got in touch with this friend of mine in the Air Force, and we agreed that we'd meet in London. And he was an officer, I was not, but as an officer, he'd managed to get some hotel accommodation. And so I jumped on the first train out of there, got into Euston Station, and by that juncture, the Canadian Army had decided to discourage Canadian soldiers from going to London because there were going to be hordes of people there. And but I got in the middle of a crowd of several hundred people. I could see MPs, Provo, on both sides looking for Canadians, obviously. And I just got in the middle, went through and waved to them. As I said, I don't regard my experiences as being particularly noteworthy. So just the fact that I was there and had the experience and survived is sufficient for my purposes.